What's going down, everybody? Welcome back to the CAD Pop Decktech series. This week, my Hogaak ElfBall deck. Let's hit it right now. Alright, my Hogaak ElfBall deck, or as I like to call it, my Gak-Ball deck. A dirty little name for an insanely fun deck. Before we get to it though, don't forget that the CAD Pop Deck Techs are brought to you by FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all your gaming needs, all your ElfBall needs, and as we're going to talk about a little bit, your Elven Empire needs. Now that's the Golgari Elf Precon that came with the release of Kaldheim, and that deck can be morphed into this deck if you so choose. And today's deck is actually a riff off of a deck that people have asked me about a ton. Every time I mention it on CAD Pop or CCO or in the Discord, I get asked, is there a list? Can I hear a deck tech on it? And that was my Hogaak budget, $200 or less, rotisserie draft charity deck that I made for Magic Fest Las Vegas in 2019. It was a heck of a time, and there's a link to that original deck in the notes for this video, so make sure to check it out. Brief synopsis of that deck for anybody who's wondering. There was only a couple basic lands. You Hermit Druid your whole deck into your graveyard until you hit a Crater Hoof, and then you try and get a Crater Hoof out of your graveyard alongside something like a Twilight's Call to mass reanimate everything all at the same time with haste, and you attack for the win. ElfBall from your graveyard, and Hogaak served as a means to get a whole ton of stuff into your graveyard by sacrificing it, milling, and stuff like that. So let's read Hogaak real quick so everybody knows what I'm talking about. Hogaak, Arisen Necropolis, is an 8/8 legendary creature avatar for Golgari Hybrid 5. You can't spend mana to cast Hogaak. Okay, so you can't spend mana. He's also got Convoke and Delve. And essentially what Convoke is you can tap creatures to help pay the mana cost of Hogaak, including colors. So if you tap a green or a black creature, you can pay for that green or black mana cost. Delve means that you exile a card from your graveyard to help pay for a generic mana cost in the mana cost of the card you're casting. So we can exile 5 cards from our graveyard and tap 2 colored creatures and cast Hogaak for free. We cast him from our command zone the first time, and then every other time that he dies, we let him go to the graveyard and keep him there because we can cast Hogaak from our graveyard, which is great. Oh, by the way, that bottom little line, Trample. 8/8 Trampler that we can cast for free from our graveyard. Okay, moving on. This deck is similar, but there's no Crater Hoof, there's no Hermit Druid, there's more lands. It's a better deck overall, and it's not that Hermit Druid deck that just wins with a Crater Hoof Behemoth any longer. I think it's got a lot more play, it's a little bit more interesting, a little bit easier to play now, not as high risk, high reward, a lot less swingy, a little bit better of a deck. Now, before we go any further, big thank you to all the Patreon supporters over at patreon.com/cadpopcast. Usually I do Patreon submitted decks here, but I was asked enough times and people had enough questions about Gak-Ball that I wanted to feature it to sort of put it to rest and get it out there so I can point to it if anybody ever asks in the future. This deck, like all CAD Pop Patreon deck techs, is for a combination of 3 groups of people. The first group of people is the new players, new to the format, new to Commander, new to Magic the Gathering, who are learning and wanting to experiment. And I think that this deck probably would suit those people because you could get that Elven Empire Precon that was released with Kaldheim, and you could play that and it would feel very similar to this. And there's a lot of those original cards in this deck that was part of the morph, the metamorphosis of this deck. The second group of people are the people looking to branch out, maybe build a second or third deck or sharpen an edge that they don't usually use. This being a graveyard deck or a reanimation deck, kind of a little bit sort of a combo deck, but not really. You could use this deck to sharpen your graveyard edge if you've never done that. And let me tell you, once you do, it's a ton of fun. And then finally, the nostalgia player, the old guy like me who is looking to feel something build around a pet card, what have you, maybe a pet strategy, And I think for a lot of people, this deck will do that as well. If you played Modern before Hogaak was banned, maybe you want to play this deck. If you're a graveyard guy, if you have a pet card like Twilight's Call like I do, which is in the deck, maybe this is your deck. And you might ask, Ryan, why Hogaak? Why not Lathril, Blade of the Elves? That was the precon commander. Great with elves. Why not Azuri, Elf Tribal, Overrun, ElfBall? Well, because Hogaak you could cast from your graveyard. And Hogaak actually gives you kind of a bunch of free little things because just having it in your graveyard allows you to cast it again. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. Let's jump into the deck. We're going to get a bunch of the minutia out of the way so we can get to the cards in business suits. We're going to start with the mana accelerants, of which we've got about 15, and then we could count maybe some more in the future. Sol Ring and Golgari Signet are our 2 artifacts, and that Golgari Signet could be an arcane signet. It doesn't really matter. Those are remnants, like a lot of things are, of that Vegas Rotisserie budget draft deck. And before we move on to the mana creature suite, I know that I am missing some, and I know that the deck isn't, air quotes, optimized, but I think it's at a place where I can play it at a table with some lower powered decks and be totally fine because it's not optimized, or play it at a table with a bunch of higher powered decks because it does kind of have that top end explosiveness and reusability with the graveyard. Lots of reanimation, and like I said, you can cast your 8/8 Trampling Commander from your graveyard for free. You can't actually use mana to cast them. Okay, the mana dorks. Birchlore Ranger, which lets us tap 2 untapped elves to make a mana. Deathrite Shaman, Elves of Deep Shadow, Elvish Mystic, Findhorn Elf, Llanowar Elves, Llanowar Mentor that lets us discard a card to make another Llanowar Elf, gives us a mana dork and fuels Hogaak. Excellent card, underrated in Hogaak decks. And Quirion Ranger, those are the 1-drops. We've got Beast Caller Savant and Priest of Titania at the 2-drop slot, Elvish Archdruid and Marwyn the Nurturer at the 3-drop slot. And then at the 4-drop slot, we've got the newly minted Canopy Tactician that we can tap for 3. And it's also a Lord, so straight bonus there. Moving on to the card draw, we've got Beast Whisperer, cast a creature, draw a card. Bloodline Shaman, you tap it, choose a creature type, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature of the chosen type, you get it. Otherwise, you put it into your graveyard, further fueling Hogaak. So that could kind of be used as a card draw spell because we run so many elves. 40 of them, or it could be used as a mana that you can spend just on your commander. Elvish Visionary, draw a card. Myara, Thorn of the Glade, when something dies, we pay 1, draw a card. Moldervine Reclamation, something dies, draw a card. Momentous Falls, we sacrifice something, draw a card. This lets us actually draw 8 cards from Hogaak, then we can cast him again for free. Pact of the Serpent, this is a new one from the Kaldheim Precon Elven Empire. Choose a creature type, target player draws X cards and loses X life, where X is the number of creatures they control of the chosen type. Mostly this is going to draw us like 10 cards. Randomly it might just kill another token player if they're at a low enough life total. Rishkar's Expertise, that's great. Siphon Mind, that's great. And newly minted Skemfar Avenger. Whenever another non-token elf or berserker we control dies, we draw a card and lose a life. No extra mana needed like with Myara. Moving on to the tutors, we actually have a ton of them. We've got a Buried Alive, which tutors to your graveyard, then we can reanimate, that's all good. Fauna Shaman, discard a card, giving us a mana for Hogaak, or reanimation fodder if we've got something bigger or more expensive. And then we can tutor a card. Fierce Empath, we tutor a big card. Final Parting, again, 1 into hand, 1 into graveyard. The same with Gerard's Orders, creature into hand, creature into graveyard. Natural Order, sacrifice a creature to get another creature, fueling Hogaak. Rune-Scarred Demon, this is potentially one of the things that we search for. Fierce Empath can find this. This might be the thing that we find with a Final Parting, and then we put it into the graveyard and we find a reanimate spell with the other card. We can get this for, maybe a 1 mana discount if that's kind of how it works out. And then we can get the card that we actually want with the Rune-Scarred Demon once we reanimate it. And then finally, a Wirewood Herald. When it dies, we search for an elf card and put it into our hand. We'll touch on the removal really quick. It's not the best removal, but it sure does the trick. We've got a Casualties of War, Death Sprout, Maelstrom Pulse, Putrefy, and Windgrace's Judgment. We've got a Null Mage Shepherd in there as well that lets us tap 4 elves to naturalize something. It's a removal, it's an elf, it kind of just checked both boxes. Finally, before we move on to the meat and potatoes of the deck, I want to talk about the general value section, and it's going to make a lot of the win cons we talk about make a lot more sense. We've got a Concordant Crossroads, which is an enchantment that makes all creatures on the battlefield have haste. Copperhorn Scout, whenever we attack, untap each other creature we control. This is going to let us reuse mana because so many elves are going to want to attack because they're all going to be buffed, but they're also going to want to tap for mana to cast the next thing. Gives everything pseudo-vigilance, and when Copperhorn Scout is a 5/5 or an 8/8, it's not going to matter being a 1/1 that you have to attack with to untap. So great little budget include, cheaper than something like Seedborn Muse, and it's an elf. Crashing Drawbridge, you tap it, creatures gain haste. Lightning Greaves, Swiftfoot Boots, protection, haste. Again, haste, very important because we can sacrifice Hogaak, let's say, to draw 8 cards off of a Momentous Fall, and then play it again for free, give it haste. A Sylvan Library, which should have been in the card draw section, but I screwed up my custom categories. Taunting Elf to get all of our beaters through. Well-Wisher and Essence Warden, because they're elves, because they're remnants from the old deck, because life gain never hurts. If we get wrathed, if our graveyard gets exiled, at least we might be at 40 or 50 life and be okay for a while. Finally, Alyssa Lana Huntmaster. This is a 3/3 elf for 4. Whenever we cast an elf spell, we can put a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token onto the battlefield. So again, just general value, good stuff in the deck, remnants from the deck when it was rotisserie drafted for a budget of $200. Not the Sylvan Library, it had one, and of course it's one of the best green card draw spells, so that's why it's in here. Let's move on to the real deal, the reason why people are here. We've got graveyard stuff and we've got our beaters. Let's start with the graveyard stuff. We've got an Eternal Witness, great. And I put Golgari Charm in here because it actually says regenerate each creature you control. That's kind of the same thing as getting all of your creatures back if somebody casts a board wipe. Now, not Wrath of God, not Damnation, not Toxic Deluge. I get it. But any Wrath or any sweeper that says destroy all creatures will just regenerate and we'll have the advantage because all of our creatures will stick around. Gerard Golgari Lichlord, he's a 2/2 elf zombie for 4. He gets +1 for each creature card in our graveyard. So first of all, he's going to be gigantic. We've got elf buff, we've got creatures in the graveyard naturally or because we put them there. And in addition to that, we can pay 3 and sacrifice another creature. Each opponent loses life equal to the sacrificed creature's power. This is our first card that answers the question, why Hogaak? Well, because we can sacrifice Hogaak, each opponent loses 8 or more. Cast Hogaak again for free, sacrifice him, each opponent loses 8 or more. Cast him again for free. We can do that 2 or 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, kill everybody. The same is kind of true for a Karazda Guild Mage. You can pump a creature and give it Intimidate, which is great, like Hogaak at 9 power, 10 power, 11 power with Intimidate is great, but more importantly, you can pay for sacrifice a non-token creature to create X 1/1 green sapperling creatures, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. You can tap all of those creatures to get your Hogaak back after you sacrifice it. Hogaak costs 7, but makes 8. Now, we got to come up with that 4 mana, but again, we're playing elves, we're going to have a ton of mana. Living Death just reanimates everything and kills everything at the same time. You swap your graveyard and your battlefield. Phyrexian Delver, we can use a creature tutor to find a Phyrexian Delver to reanimate something in our graveyard. We're going to get there in a second. We've got Reanimate, Shallow Grave, which is an instant speed reanimate, but then you have to sacrifice the creature at the end of turn. Vigor Mortis, which is 4 mana, and if one of those is green, the creature enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. Twilight's Call, Mass Reanimate, pet card. You can cast it as an instant for 8 mana. We've got a Rift Sweeper that lets us actually pull something from exile if we had to exile it due to delving, and then we shuffle it into our library so we can tutor or draw it later. And then finally, we've got what I think is a little bit of a hidden gem in Reincarnation. It's an instant for green 1. Choose target creature. When that creature dies this turn, return a creature card from its owner's graveyard to the battlefield under the control of that creature's owner. You could target a creature, and when it dies, you return a creature. Could be the same creature. It could be target Hogaak, sacrifice it, do whatever the stuff that we're doing is, get back an Elf Lord or something that makes mana or something that pumps your whole team. Wink, wink. This card's got a ton of little subtle purposes, and if you target something that your opponent controls, you can give them back something else if that's kind of gains you some political favor or makes something enter the battlefield that they might not want to enter the battlefield. It's a cool little card. Now, let's move on to the final section. This is our Lords and our beaters. We've got a Dwynen Giltleaf Dean, a 3/4 elf warrior with reach for 4. Other elves get +1/+1, and whenever Dwynen attacks, we gain 1 life for each attacking elf we control. Little bit of life gain value there, that's great, never hurts. We're going to pump our whole team, that's great. Elvish Warmaster, a 2/2 elf warrior for 2. Whenever 1 or more other elves enter the battlefield under our control, we create another elf warrior. But we can only do that once per turn. Once on our turn, once on opponent, once on opponent, once on opponent, once on our turn, etc. Also, pay 7. Elves you control get +2/+2 and gain Death Touch until end of turn. 7 mana is going to be easy. You can tap literally 1 creature and make more than 7 mana in Priest of Titania or Elvish Archdruid. Azuri Renegade Leader regenerates an elf, or you can pay 5. All your creatures get +3/+3 and trample until end of turn. That's overrun. We can make 5. We can make 7. We can make 10. We can overrun 13, 14 times. It's all great. Imperious Perfect, Elf Lord, and you tap to create an Elf Warrior creature token. Great for attacking. You untap with your Copperhorn Scout. You make a token. You get an extra token from your Elvish Warmaster. Good little value play. Never hurts that it pumps your whole team. Timberwatch Elf, you can tap it to give target creature +X/+X, where X is the number of elves on the battlefield. This guy can tap and give Hogaak like +15/+15, could potentially turn Hogaak into a one-shot kill. Again, it answers the question, why Hogaak? Shaman of the Pack is a 3-drop that when it enters the battlefield, target opponent loses life equal to the number of elves we control. We could cast it, make an opponent lose 10 or 15, sacrifice it to Karazda Guildmage, living end it back, sacrifice it, or even just kill it ourselves, have it die, and then reanimate it, and then Twilight's Call it. So this is going to be a good one that's going to get us chunks of damage off of an opponent. Abomination of Llanowar, it's got power and toughness equal to the number of elf cards in your graveyard plus elf cards we control. So it's going to be huge. Again, chunks of damage. Another great one to sacrifice to Gerard or that Karazda Guildmage to get a whole bunch of tokens or a whole bunch of damage. Next up in the chunks of damage category is Lathril Blade of the Elves. We are playing it, it's brand new. When it deals combat damage to a player, create that many 1/1 green Elf Warrior creature tokens, which is great because it has menace as well. And it's going to be pumped. It's not going to be a 2/3. It's going to be a 5/6 or a 8/9 or bigger. Going to give us a ton of bodies, and with those bodies we can tap 10 and tap it for each opponent to lose 10 life and we gain 10 life. Again, chunks of damage. It's an elf. It's going to give us incidental token value. It's going to make more mana with our Elvish Archdruid and our Priest of Titania. It's going to give us extra mana after we attack to recast Hogaak because it's going to give us tokens. Great on every checkpoint of the card. Last 2 cards in the deck. We've got a Decimator of Provinces, which again answers the question, why Hogaak? This is a very budget Craterhoof Behemoth. I love this card. This is a 10-drop 7/7 Eldrazi Boar. So why the heck does it go in this deck? When you cast Decimator of Provinces, creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain trample until end of turn. Now, that is a cast trigger. You can't reanimate into that. But it's also got Emerge, which says green, 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 6. And you can cast this spell by emerging it if you sacrifice a creature and then pay the difference in mana cost. So we sacrifice Hogaak, and then we can cast our Decimator of Provinces for 2 mana. Hogaak's colored mana pays for 2 of the greens because it's green. Hogaak's colorless pays for 5 of the 6 colorless requirements in the Decimator's Emerge cost. So we're left with a colorless and a green. Boom. Colorless and green give my whole team +2/+2 and trample until end of turn. And this also has trample and haste. So the first turn it comes in and attacks as a 9/9. It gives all 15 of our elves +2/+2. We crash in for 2 mana. We can find it with our Fierce Empath, with our creature tutors. It's great. And then the final answer to why Hogaak is Overwhelming Stampede. This kind of took the Crater Hoof Behemoth spot. If we've got a commander sitting in our graveyard that for 0 mana we can cast, and then Overwhelming Stampede for 8, we don't even need Elf Lords. And this is kind of the backup plan if you get Wrath because you're an aggro deck. So let's say we've got a ton of mana, which we will. We sacrifice our Hogaak to the Karud the Guildmage. We get 8 tokens. They're all going to have haste because Concordant Crossroads or Crashing Drawbridge. We delve a bunch of stuff away, tap 2 creatures, Hogaak, Overwhelming Stampede, our 6 remaining Saprolinks from the Karud the Guildmage, plus the Guildmage, plus the Hogaak, because they're all going to have haste, can all attack for 80 damage, plus whatever else we've got on the battlefield that isn't Hogaak, Karud the Guildmage, and Saproling tokens. That doesn't account for your elf tokens, your native elves, your value elves, your lord elves, your pump elves, your overruns. This deck's going to do a ton of damage. And it's facilitated by having an 8 power, 7 cost, or free commander in your graveyard. That's why Hogaak. Generally, it plays like an ElfBall deck. Generally, it makes a ton of mana. Generally, it draws a lot of cards. It's going to check all the boxes that commander players want it to check. It's going to fight right through graveyard hate. It doesn't care. It gets its graveyard exiled 2-3 times in a game. Just plow right through. If you do find that your graveyard's getting exiled too often, maybe you do an Altar of Dementia, which kind of goes infinite with Hogaak. Maybe you go back to the Hermit Druid plan. If Decimator of Provinces is in your graveyard more often than not because you're playing some of that self-mill, maybe you go back to a Crater Hoof that just ETBs instead of cast. But I wanted to kind of file the nails down on the deck a little bit because I want to play it at casual tables. I don't want to be that deck. And I wanted the mana to run a little bit nicer than it did with the Hermit Druid because I had to run so few basics, and some of those ended up being like enter the battlefield tapped lands or just added unnecessary kind of collection equity to the deck that I didn't want to spend on another casual deck. That being said, there's only 28 land in the deck, which is a little bit light. There used to only be 26. But with some of the cuts and the evolution I've added. Please let me know in the comments or on Twitter at CADPopcast if you think anything needs to be cut or what the weakest couple cards are that I could maybe replace with land. Important to note because we've got so many green 1-drops that add extra mana to the deck. Not one single green source of mana enters the battlefield tapped, which is important. The only ETB tapped land in the deck is a Bojuka Bog. Obviously, Graveyard Hate's important, so it's in there, and it's not the type of thing that you would play on turn 1 anyways. So as long as you've got a green in your opener, you've got 13 kind of chances to make extra mana on turn 2 because you dropped a mana dork or a rock, extra mana turn 3, and it only snowballs or elf balls from there. So like I said, let me know in the comments, let me know on Twitter, links to this deck and the Budget Vegas Rotisserie Draft deck, both in the show notes, and the Vegas Rotisserie Draft is actually, a link to that is actually in the Gak-Ball proper deck description, so check it out, let me know what you think. Big thank you to FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all of your Hogaak, ElfBall, Elven Empire needs. And big thank you to all of the Patreon supporters over at patreon.com/CADPopcast. If you want to have your deck featured, it is one of the benefits to becoming a patron. Find the appropriate reward tier, pledge, send your deck in. My unending thanks to the patrons. You guys bring the content to everybody and I couldn't make it without you. I hope you like it. I hope you share it. If you or anybody you know is interested in making an ElfBall deck or building that Elven Empire deck into something that can hang with your friends or in a more competitive meta, take some of the cards I suggested today, try them out. I promise you'll have a ton of fun. Don't forget to check out Commander Ad Populum podcast every Wednesday wherever you get your podcasts if you're finding the YouTube channel randomly. And all that being said, I will see you next Wednesday.